So it's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Catherine Wolfram. She is the Cora Jane Flood Professor of Business Administration at the Haas School of Business at the University at UC Berkeley. She's also a faculty director of the Energy Institute at Haas and scientific director for energy at the Center for Effective Global Action. And Catherine will give us an overview of energy issues in developing countries, particularly with respect to access, I believe. And then we will have Moussa as Blimpo, who is an economist and the chief economist office of the Africa region, as a discussant. Catherine. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to make two announcements. I apologize. So the first one is all the papers that we've received and the presentations which are being uploaded as we get them are available at the URL that's there, or you can go on the GGKP website and click on events. Okay, that's the first thing. And then the second thing is remember to vote. Okay, there's a ballot box outside, and please remember to vote. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marianne. Someone will bring up the presentation, I take it. I wanted to start. I'm an energy economist primarily. Over the past several years, my work has migrated more and more into work in the developing world with the project that I'll describe today in Kenya, ongoing work in India and Ghana. But I really think of myself as primarily an energy economist. Should I do something here?
I can do it for you.
There, great. You need F5. Usually it works. All right, so I wanted to start with some high-level thoughts on energy in the developing world. And I realize that for some of you, this might be well-known material. For others of you who are focused on other sectors besides energy, this might be more new. So I'm an empirical economist, and I like to think about different ways to display data. And this is one of my favorite ways of displaying where in the world people are using electricity. It's the world at night. So you can take the California view, say, and look at the picture and say you can really see where people are living. You can see the Bay Area, and you can see LA. And then if you look north, you can see kind of Portland, Seattle, the big cities. Oh, yeah, you can see the eastern seaboard, Washington, D.C. corridor kind of blends together. If you look at Western Europe, you can see London, Paris, Madrid, and oh, yeah, there's the rest of the world. So here is where people in the world really live. The darker the red, the more people per square kilometer. So you can see that in northern India and China, there are a lot of people, that sub-Saharan Africa is about as dense as the eastern U.S., and so if you superimpose the lights on the people, you can see that there are vast areas of the world where there are a lot of people, but not many lights. And so if you think of lights as kind of a summary statistic for electricity consumption, there are lots of places in the world where people are not consuming very much electricity. All of sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, consumes as much electricity as the island of Manhattan. And so in terms of per capita consumption, it's just vastly different. Similarly, parts of northern India, Bangladesh, are just not consuming much electricity as represented by the lights here. Of course, that's going to change over the next 25 years. And we think that that probably should change. And for development purposes, it's a good thing if that changes. Here's the more boring economist way to represent the same type of facts. So what I've represented here is total energy consumption, not just electricity. We're adding together gasoline, natural gas, electricity, converting it all to the similar units to British thermal units, and then plotting past consumption as well as projected consumption for both the developing world and the developed world. So you can see, roughly approximated by OECD, non-OECD, you can see that the developing world has already passed the developed world in terms of total energy consumption. That happened back in 2007, 2008. And the forecast is that the bulk of the growth in energy consumption is projected to come from the developing world. So if we care about world energy issues, if we care about world oil prices, for instance, if we care about climate change, we really need to understand energy consumption in the developing world. I have some previous work with my colleague Paul Gertler that suggests that this forecast, which projects about doubling roughly in the developing world, might seriously underestimate the growth in the developing world. And if you look at that, it's basically a linear extrapolation of the growth over the recent time period. And there are not that many things that grow linearly. And so we suspect that as people come out of poverty, as they gain access to electricity, as they buy their first refrigerator, as they buy their first motorbike, start using roads, that there's a very nonlinear relationship between income growth and energy consumption. And so we suspect that that projection might underestimate the potential growth in energy consumption. From a development perspective, though, as I've emphasized, this is probably a good thing. What I've plotted here is the log of GDP per capita in 2013, and we're back to electricity here. So this is kilowatt hours per capita. Every dot is a country, and the ones highlighted in yellow are the most populous countries. There are very few relationships in economics that are this distinct, right? That is a nice upward sloping line. R squared, if you fit just a univariate regression through that, the R squared is like 0.85. And so it's very clear that there's a high correlation between energy consumption and GDP per capita. A lot of policymakers interpret this as causal, as electricity consumption causes growth, development. And so there's a lot of emphasis on pushing electricity consumption. I've purposely plotted it the opposite way because we don't really know whether, in fact, electricity consumption causes growth or whether growth causes electricity consumption. As we get richer, have higher tastes for things like air conditioning, refrigerated foods, and so it could be that growth causes electricity consumption. At a fundamental level, we don't really understand the relationship between energy consumption, electricity consumption, and growth. The other thing that I would emphasize is, and this is one of the reasons that I really like studying the energy industries and the electricity industry in particular, there are a lot of ways that you can use a kilowatt hour in an economy. So we're using it for commercial lighting right now. You use it in hospitals, you use it in factories, you use it in homes. And so we don't know whether a kilowatt hour in a rural household has the same impact on growth as a kilowatt hour in an urban factory, for instance. And they might have very different implications for growth. So I want to, at a high level, emphasize that there are a lot of things that we don't yet understand about energy in the developing world at a pretty fundamental level. So I'm back here to plotting total energy consumption, not just electricity. And what I'm doing is plotting actual energy consumption. This is for China. I'm going to show you again for India in a second. So the black line reflects actual energy consumption normalized to 1990. 1990 is 1. So you can see that there has been explosive growth in energy consumption in China. By 2010, energy consumption was almost 4 times as high as it was 30 years before, 20 years before, in 1990. It's just explosive growth. But what I want to emphasize here is what has been reflected by forecasts of energy consumption. And so that's what's reflected by the colored lines there. So if you look at 2010, for instance, the blue purplish lines at the bottom reflect projections that were made in the late 1990s for consumption out to 2010. And so you can see that in the late 1990s, they were projecting that growth, energy consumption in China would only be 2 times as high as it was in 1990. But those projections were surpassed but before 2005, essentially. So they were wrong 5 years early. And so they had to revise the estimates up. And basically, you can see that the colored lines are always below the black lines. So continuously, the forecasts for energy consumption have under-predicted actual energy consumption. And that's after, you can look at 2010 and 2015, pretty serious revisions upwards. So compare the early 1990 or late 1990s estimates for 2010, they were forecasting 2 times the growth. By mid-2000, the projections were up to more than 3 times the growth relative to 1990. That's a pretty serious revision in the forecast. But still, the forecasts were underestimated. These are forecasts from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, but they are not alone. The International Energy Agency, IEA, has very, very similar forecasts to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. BP also does energy forecasts, but basically everyone has underestimated the growth in energy consumption in China. So you might say, well, there are a lot of things that we underestimated about China. We underestimated GDP growth. But if you adjust these, there's a pretty simple relationship that you can back out between GDP and energy consumption. If you adjust the forecast for the actual GDP growth, you see that there's still an underestimate, that the GDP underestimate only represents about 25% of the underestimates. So this is not just a story about underestimated GDP growth in China. It's also not just a story about China. So here's a similar projection or a similar graph for India. As you see, 1990 is normalized to 1. So again, not quite as explosive growth as China, but quite explosive growth. So by 2010, it's almost 3 times as high as 1990. And again, basically all of the colored lines, all of the forecasts are below the actual. So we are continuously underestimating energy consumption in both China and India. There's a similar graph that you can show for sub-Saharan Africa. One of the colored lines is above the black lines, but in general, you see the same pattern again, that we're underestimating growth in energy in the developing world. And so I suggest that this implies that we have a pretty rudimentary understanding of energy consumption in the developing world. Even our most basic forecasts are systematically biased and systematically underestimating energy consumption in the developing world. So often in discussions about energy in the developing world, we quickly turn from broad statistics like I've just presented to discussions about the people in the world who don't have electricity. At this conference, there was a session on rural electrification. We often hear the statistic that there are 1.x, sometimes it's 1.2, sometimes it's 1.1 billion people in the world who live without electricity in their homes. And in fact, in my first project in the developing world, we worked on a rural electrification project. So this is a picture of a woman to whom we brought electricity. She was so delighted that we had brought her electricity that she gave me a chicken as a thank you. I never believed that as an energy economist I would be given a chicken as part of my research. But I want to be a little bit provocative and suggest that the focus on rural electrification, the focus on the 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity is misplaced. And I'm going to explain why I think that's the case. So the study that this woman was involved with was at a high level, a study to try to estimate the effects of rural electrification. We wanted to bring electricity to people in Western Kenya like her and measure how it impacted their lives. We tell ourselves stories about how if we bring people electricity, kids will study more at night, people will, be able to have income-producing assets that they purchase. We tell ourselves lots of stories about how electricity affects people's lives, and we wanted to test that rigorously. So the way we did that was to implement a randomized controlled trial. And I want to explain, some people know what it is, some people might not, but for everyone's purposes, I want to explain exactly how we implemented the randomized controlled trial here. We selected 150 communities, and we defined the communities as centered around existing transformers. And then we completely randomly divided those communities into treatment and control, like literally just flipped a coin. If you got heads, you were in the treatment group, tails, you were in the control group. And then with the treatment group, what we did is we offered 3 levels of subsidies to connect to the electrical grid in Western Kenya. One of the subsidies was 100%. We paid the full cost for the homes to connect to the electricity grid. In the control group, they could continue, if they wanted, to connect to the grid at the existing price, which was about $400 per person. Now, keep in mind, per household. Keep in mind that this is in an area where average annual incomes are about $800. So people were being asked to pay half of their annual income to connect to the electricity grid. We then waited about 18 to 24 months, and then we compared lots of socioeconomic factors and outcomes in the treatment group to those similar factors and outcomes in the control group. And so this will give us an estimate of the impact of electrification. Because we randomized the communities between treatment and control, they're exactly identical. They should be identical in terms of baseline income, in terms of baseline employment. A lot of the households in our study were in subsistence agriculture. And in terms of things that we can't really measure, like gumption or ambition or something. But because we've randomized these 2 groups, they should be identical along all those dimensions. And then the only difference is the fact that the treatment group was offered the subsidy to connect to the electrical grid. And so we can measure what the effects of that connection were. So just quickly to describe how this was implemented, we worked with a local NGO, Innovations for Poverty Action. Here they're holding a community meeting describing the subsidy process, especially for the households for which we didn't pay 100% of the connection cost. They had to go to the bank, they had to deposit money, they had to show us that they deposited money, and so we're explaining that process to the households there. Then the Rural Electrification Authority in Kenya installed poles. They built poles. They dug holes. I was there on the day that the woman who gave me the chicken had the drop line dropped to her house. They kind of fiddled with the wires, screwed in the light bulb. The first time it didn't work. Then they screwed in they fiddled some more with the wires, screwed in the light bulb, and there was light. It was really quite magical. And as in this picture, there were 15 local kids kind of watching the whole process take place. We were also worried, especially for the households to whom we brought the free connection, to whom we paid the full $400, that we would have the drop line coming to their house, and then they wouldn't have enough money to do the internal wiring. And so we offered, as part of the experiment, we offered them these ready boards, which provided essentially, a light socket and 2 electrical outlets. So at a minimum, they could do cell phone charging and have some basic lighting services. So let me tell you a couple things about what we found. In order to do our study, we had to first establish who in not have electricity yet. And so we sent field teams out to do a census mapping exercise to figure out around each transformer who had electricity, who didn't. Here's an example of one of our transformers. The T in the middle is the transformer itself, and then we've drawn a 600-meter radius around that. Everyone within that 600-meter radius is eligible for a connection at $400. The dots are households. If they're green, they don't have an electricity connection. If they're yellow, they do. This is pretty representative of what we found. We found that on average, 95% of the households within this 600-meter radius did not have a connection. And so we thought it was important to document the fact that there are households like the one that's basically covered by the transformer that are living right next to the infrastructure. Literally, you could throw a stone out of that house and hit the transformer. Often in discussions about energy in the developing world, you hear households characterized as either on-grid, they already have a connection, or off-grid. And this idea of off-grid connotes that they're 100 kilometers from the nearest infrastructure, that you need to spend a lot of money to bring them the technology. But we thought it was important to document that there are people who are literally living under grid, where it's not a technological problem we have to solve. The infrastructure is there, but it's more of a socioeconomic problem. Some subsequent work by the Center for Global Development has emphasized that our finding in Western Kenya is consistent with other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, that there are a lot of people who are living, as we describe them, as undergrid. So another thing that we found is that, well, let me back up. As part of the baseline survey, before we even emphasized to our homes that this was a study about electrification, we asked them kind of hypothetically, if you were to get an electricity connection, what would you buy? What would be the first appliance that you would buy? Many people talked about lighting. Many people talked about cell phone charging, although everybody already owned a cell phone, so they didn't talk about buying the cell phone. They talked about TV, but the fourth most popular appliance was an iron. And at first I thought, okay, this is kind of part of middle class aspirations. People want very pressed clothing to look like they're part of the middle class. That might be part of it, but it also turns out that in this part of the country, there are parasites that live in the cloth. And so ironing the cloth solves a public health problem. It surprised me, though, that irons were so far up on the list. And I think it's also, I realized that yesterday there was a discussion about the three-wheeled car and whether, a solar home system is providing the same services as a grid. Keep in mind that irons on average use 1,500 watts. Solar home systems, the most prevalent solar home system in Western Kenya is provided by M-KOPA. That provides 8 watts. So you have a 1,500 watt iron, you would need 200 M-KOPA solar home systems to power an iron. It's just a mismatch between the services provided by a solar home system and the services that people desire. Whereas with grid, it's kind of perfect for an iron. You're sharing the resources across a lot of households. People use their iron for not very much time. As long as they're not all using it at exactly the same time, they can share their resources. All right, so here's the kind of major punchline of the work. As I said, we set it up as a randomized control trial. We could evaluate the impacts of electrification. And what we found was frankly, to me, quite depressing. It was intellectually fascinating, but kind of at a personal level, absolutely depressing. We gave them at the end of, we let them have electricity for about, they still have electricity, but we waited for about 18 to 24 months before we went back and surveyed them. And we asked questions over an hour and a half. We asked them lots and lots of questions. You worry from a statistical perspective that you might find, okay, if you ask them 100 questions, just by the nature of statistics, you'll find 5 questions where there are differences between treatment and control. But we didn't want to be reporting things that were just statistical anomalies. And so to avoid that, we pre-specified 8 outcomes that we were most interested in. And so I'm showing you here the results for 7 of those 8. The first 4 that I'll describe are basic kind of economic outcomes, some summary measures of their economic lives. So whether or not someone in the household was employed outside of subsistence agriculture, whether they were running a business, the hours that they'd worked outside of subsistence agriculture, their annual consumption, and we summarize this with 23 food items that have been shown by other people to be good indicators of kind of overall consumption. The eighth thing that isn't reported here is assets. We looked at household assets. And what I'm reporting with those zeros is absolutely no difference between the treatment and control. The next set of indicators are non-economic indicators. So one thing you hear is people will replace kerosene lighting with electric lighting. They'll have better respiratory health. We compared the respiratory health of treatment and control, no difference. Another thing you hear is that people will watch TV, listen to the radio, and become kind of parts of modern society. They'll be more informed about political and social issues. No difference between treatment and control. So the life satisfaction, in some ways, I feel like was a concession to the non-economic social sciences. We have these great measures of economic well-being, right? Your consumption, the assets that you own. We also asked, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? So this is the one measure where we found a difference between treatment and control. It's not a huge difference. It's about a fifth of a standard deviation, but it's statistically significant. So I think, that's something to keep in mind in interpreting our outcomes. Another story that you often hear about electrification is that kids will study more at night. Kids will acquire more human capital. So with our households, we gave the kids tests. We gave them an English or Swahili test and a math test. Again, no difference between treatment and control. So as I described, I found this quite depressing. And I'm not yet willing to recommend against rural electrification. I think this is one study. I think we need to do many more. I will say that I've seen similar studies from similar randomized control trials that have looked at outcomes from bringing people solar home systems. And they're similarly kind of meh. Maybe one of them will find that kids study more at night, but they're studying less during the day. And there aren't impacts that people are finding on kids' test scores. And so I think we need to at least entertain the idea that rural electrification is not driving development. But I have two comments on that. For one, I think that doesn't mean we need to give up on electricity as a way to drive development. What we're testing here is rural household electrification. As I emphasized, there are many other ways in which economies use electricity. For instance, here's a shopping mall serving ice cream, right? So there's commercial uses, there are urban uses, there are industrial uses, there are small and medium-sized businesses in rural parts of the world. And so we've looked at one outcome. This is the outcome that there's a lot of policy attention on. We talk often about the 1.2 billion people who don't have access to electricity and have lots of programs designed to them. But we're leaving out a lot of other ways in which we use electricity. And those, I think we need more research on this, but those could be driving growth more so than rural electrification. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that basically if you've talked about the 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity, you've essentially almost one for one identified the poorest people in the world. And so I think there are definitely moral issues. There are things that we should think about in terms of helping these people come out of poverty. But I am not convinced that electricity is even on the top 5 or maybe even top 10 ways to help these very poor people. So this is a picture of one of our households in rural Kenya. You can see that she has mud walls. She has a thatched roof. She doesn't have good sanitation. She doesn't have running water. She doesn't have good health care. She doesn't have good education for her kids. We need to think about different development outcomes and prioritize them versus bringing people electricity. Is electricity the best way? If our objective is to help these 1.2 billion people, is bringing them electricity, even, as I say, in the top 5 ways to help them immediately. I also think that maybe bringing electricity to nearby businesses might help these people more than bringing electricity to their homes. That might spur the economy, might provide employment opportunities that bringing electricity to their homes does not. I also worry that rural electrification and the focus that policymakers, politicians are placing on it is not just neutral, not just having zero effects, as we found on the rural households, but is in fact diverting resources from things that could be more beneficial from a development perspective. So what I'm picturing here is a transformer. You can kind of see the transformer hidden in the trees, and then the poles supporting the transformer. And I tried to frame the picture against the panes of the glass to show you just how tipped over those poles are. So as we embark on rural electrification, we're investing a lot of assets, putting a lot of poles like this in rural parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Those need to be kept up. That imposes a lot of costs on entities like Kenya Power, and potentially diverts assets, diverts resources from keeping up the grid in urban settings, for instance, or the grid that's supplying factories and businesses. So this is another way to make the same point. What I'm plotting here on the left is over time the number of customers of Kenya Power. So the black line, the dark black line, is plotting residential customers. You can see Kenya has had an ambitious rural electrification program. They've added a lot of residential customers. The gray and light gray are the commercial and industrial customers. Those have kind of trended gradually up. And what we're representing on the right is the average consumption per customer. And so you can see the black line, as we're adding these residential customers, we're adding people who are using smaller and smaller amounts of electricity. In our study, we found that the average household used 5 kilowatt hours of electricity per month. Keep in mind that the average U.S. household uses 23 kilowatt hours in a day. So people in Western Kenya are using as much as the typical American uses in, like 3 hours or 4 hours or something, just not using much electricity. Once you hear that, maybe it's not surprising that we're not finding huge impacts. And so as Kenya Power is adding a bunch of these small users, they're spending a lot on the infrastructure and not earning much revenue. And so potentially this is leading to less good service for the existing grid. I think that this research in Western Kenya, to me, has kind of posed more questions than it's helped to answer. I think there are a lot of questions that I have about why the impacts were so low. One hypothesis I have is that people are just too poor to take benefits of electricity yet. You can't eat electricity. In order to consume electricity, you need to buy appliances. In order to buy those appliances, you need some baseline level of savings or income. And so it could be that the households are as yet too poor to really use the benefits of electricity. It could also be that the electricity that they were provided in Western Kenya was, from a reliability perspective, pretty awful. So you often hear about people not getting 24/7 electricity. Maybe the lights are off for 6, 12, 18 hours a day. In Western Kenya, or in Kenya in general, we don't have load shedding problems. It's not that there's insufficient generation, but what you do have are problems on the distribution grid. 20% of the transformers in our area, out of our 150 transformers, were down during our study period. And when they were down for 3 months. So, what's the point of getting an electricity connection when you don't have electricity at all for a median of 3 months? There were some transformers that were down for a whole year. And so I think we need to understand more about reliability and how the reliability affects economic growth and development. I have an ongoing project, or an early project, in Ghana, where I've teamed up with some engineers who have developed a really novel way using cell phones to measure reliability. I think part of the reason we haven't done as much research on reliability is it's really, really hard to measure. Even utilities don't have very good estimates of when there are outages. And I'd be happy to talk about that more in the discussion. To close, I just want to make 3 points. As I've said at the outset, I think this is a real growth opportunity for graduate students, for young people in the world. We have a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover. There's a lot about energy in the developing world that we don't understand, kind of fundamental forecasts that we're getting wrong. From a climate perspective, I think we need to develop both technological and policy solutions that work and think about how those work in the developing world. We can't solve climate change without thinking about growth in energy in the developing world. And, I'm emphasizing climate change here to close because to me that's the main motivation. For studying energy in the developing world, there are definitely development issues that we don't understand. As I've emphasized, I suspect that there's too much focus on rural electrification, and I'll be curious to hear reactions to that in the discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne, and the organizers for inviting me to share my thought on what this work means for policy. I'd like also to thank Catherine, her co-authors, and the team at Berkeley for going above and beyond to provide us this very high quality research and help advance our knowledge on this issue. These are some of the issues we are also working on in the Africa Chief Economist's Office. And for full disclosure, I'm grateful to have Catherine on our technical advisory board and helping us shape the issues very well and in the most rigorous way possible. I will not focus on the technical detail of this research because I think that's not the most important point here. I want to focus more on the policy aspect and what this really means for us when we think about policy formulation. When you read the paper, you will know that the team has gotten a whole long list of questions that they've addressed in many different ways, and oftentimes when the questions aren't addressed in a satisfactory way, they acknowledge the issues in a very transparent way in the paper, and that's a very great piece of research there. Now, I would like to make 3 points. The first point is how we should think generally in terms of policy, moving from very serious research like this one that we've just heard, especially big policy items like rural electrification in general. The second point that I would like to talk about is the issue of complementarities. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that in many parallel sessions, and the distinction between a necessary condition for development and transformation in our economies and what we really often do in our research, which is trying to find sufficient conditions for development. And I will build on these 2 points to humbly provide my thought on what this means for researchers, for development institutions like ourselves here, and also for political leaders and the people who I think are the 3 great actors that could come together to drive the development agenda. So on my first point about linking research and policy and thinking about policy formulation, I would like to quote Larry Summers, who is one of the few people who have experience at the very highest level in policy, both in the U.S. government, but also here at the World Bank, but who happen also to be high-level academics producing cutting-edge research as well. He was asked recently about the difference between policy formulation, the needs of policy formulation and the needs of research in his experience. And this is what he says, and I'm half quoting and half paraphrasing him. Yeah. He says that there is a huge difference between the needs of research and the needs of policy formulation. He says, as a researcher, what you do is that you identify an important issue that other people haven't thought about very seriously. You study it, you look at all the various aspects of the issue, you show that it's an important issue, and once you've done that, you've made a great contribution. Therefore, the essence of research is to abstract from many issues to focus on one aspect of an issue and make sure that you provide the most rigorous possible answers to those issues. For policy, however, the most important thing is to make sure that you take into account all important issues in policy formulation. And if you forget to take into account only one issue that is important, you are probably not doing your work very well, and that could lead you to make the wrong decision. So what does this mean for conferences like this? So when you go in the parallel sessions and then the researcher finished presenting their research, don't ask, what does this mean for policy? That's not what they were studying. They were studying to advance our knowledge. The right question to ask is, how does this advance our knowledge? What do we know now that we didn't know before? Take the answer to that question. Go add it to the other 20 considerations that matters for policy formulation. And then you will come up with better policy formulation over time. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second point is about complementarities and the whole issue of necessary conditions versus sufficient conditions. What I take away reading this paper and the finding that is coming out of it, with all the great rigor that went into producing it, is that rural electrification is not going to be a sufficient condition for development agenda. But I don't come away from it that is not a necessary condition. I think we might have an easy way to actually agree that this is likely to be a necessary condition. So the whole question is about what else would it take in addition to that necessary condition to be able to achieve the development agenda. In a separate forum here, I heard one of our senior directors at the World Bank here, who has also served in the government of his home country and came back here recently, complained that, you get in the office, you know that you need to get 2-3 things right before you get a chance for impact. And the moment you do the first thing, you are being challenged that one thing doesn't work, and that we need to be patient and we need to get things right. So if we could agree that electrification could be or is a necessary condition for development, then the next step is just do it if you can afford it as a country. And if you can afford it and can get some help to do it, get the help and do it. Now, the issue is that there are many necessary conditions, not only electrification. And there is still a need for prioritization. And there is a need for us to think about which should come first. Where should you put the scarce resources that you have in the development agenda? And I will talk about that when I start thinking about what this means for each of us. So my last point, where I want now to offer my thought about what this means for all the different key actors involved in the development agenda. I'll start with researchers, where I see myself fitting as well. So first of all, I think we are shying away from big questions. And those big questions are the questions that are actually policy relevant. But they happen to be questions that cannot be answered with the rigor that we conduct our research nowadays. And in fact, when you read this paper that Catherine just presents, she makes a lot of these points. The paper makes a lot of these points. And in fact, when it comes to thinking about whether to pursue the rural electrification agenda or not, one of the points they are making is that not until we see the welfare effect on investing on other things like education, health, roads, etc. Now, how do you do that? You can't run an experiment to compare road, education, health, and all those. You can't do that. So we have to compromise and try to find the right balance to provide policymakers with the tools that they need to make the right decisions, and understand that that cannot always be rigorous. So I will implore the more senior academics in the room here to be open and encourage young people like myself to engage on important questions that might end up not necessarily be the type of rigor that will be required to produce the most cutting-edge answer to that. So that's for research. And at the personal level, I think also as a researcher, if we intend not to stop at producing just knowledge, but to engage in policy, then it's also our responsibility to take the step in learning other things. That is not our area of expertise because, again, coming back to the first point that I made. What does it mean for development institutions? Well, if I build on the second point that I made about, identifying necessary conditions, the necessary condition is about giving a chance for development. It's not about delivering development itself. It just says that if you don't have it, you have less chance, right? So for institutions like ourselves here, I think we need to do more coordination. We need to do more joint project. And I was pleased yesterday when I arrived in my office to see the independent evaluation group come up with a report just yesterday talking about joint project. It's on different aspects of joint project, but I think there need to be more coordination to tackling issues. And this is not a new thing even in development theories. You go back to the seminal paper of Rosenstein-Roden looking at the industrialization in Eastern Europe. All these issues of complementarities are studied in a way that are very, very understandable and makes a lot of sense. And finally, for political leaders and the people on the ground, who also matter a lot for policy formulation, I think the most important thing is that we need to see more done on the social contract dimension. I remember in Togo, Togo is my home country, just a few years back when I went there, I saw a lot of new roads being built in the capital city. But when you talk to the people, they're like, we don't eat roads. Why? They're looking at their bottom line. We don't eat roads. So there need to be political leadership and a social contract, an effort toward a social contract that would make us, the society as a whole, understand that there are certain things that need to be gotten right before we'll get a chance. And in the process of getting those things right, we might not necessarily see impact at the moment we are doing them. But since these are things that will give us a chance, we need to have the patience to try and get them right. And I think this is my time. I have 5 minutes for this discussion. And these are the thoughts that I had and wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Sure. To begin with, I'd like to start with a question that we got from online, from the webinar.
Hello, everyone. This is a question from Edward Hoyt at Apt Associates. This is a question for Dr. Wolfram. Do you think that 18 months is long enough to show impacts, the impacts that you measured for? And on health impacts, can you comment on whether or not electrification changed other energy consumption patterns, especially use of biomass fuel in households?
We'll take maybe 3 questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much for a very insightful paper. I think also that having looked at Kenya and the electrification in Kenya, I think one of the major problems is not about electrification, but how we do it. So the main thing we need to really focus on is finding the needs. I think you pointed on it a little bit in your findings. What do households need electricity for? And then provide for that. Because in my own research, a lot of them say we need power pumps for irrigation systems. We need just mechanizing little things that helps the woman in the household to grate his cassava, his ugali, her ugali, and so on, so that it reduces the drudgery of living for them and also helps them to earn little incomes and grow in the income ladder. Providing light and lighting, which is mostly what rural electrification in households in Africa focuses on, is hardly a priority for many because they have 12 hours of lighting a day. And the rest is for resting, for sleeping, and moonlight stories. And the issue you raise in terms of the impacts on education and all the variables we always claim it does have impact on, that research is really very clear and very correct in your findings. You are saying it's preliminary, but life experiences in Africa shows that the most better performing academics from Africa are mostly from rural areas where you don't have electrification. So when you have electrification, if I use my own self as an example, I grew up in a village, had nothing like electrification when I was going to primary school, secondary school. I only saw the light bulb first in a university. And I think about my children have 24 hours of electricity in the UK. I don't think they're performing that well in committing their time to studying, committing their time to productive activities, and so on and so forth. So we need to actually try and prioritize the needs of the people by the people, not by our models and our thinking about what they need. And for institutions like the World Bank, my own African Development Bank, I think the real issue is actually mapping the needs of the people and addressing them rather than providing what we think they need and hope that it will produce the change we think it should provide.
Yeah, Paul Eakins, UCL in London. And thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation, which I enjoyed very much. But actually, I think Mr. Blimpo's discussant comments were really profound and important. They match very well. I mean, I do mainly research in developed countries, and we've just finished a big project on resource efficiency, and ask ourselves the question: why do people not take up cost-effective resource efficiency options? And the only answer we could come up with was something that we characterized as a web of constraints. So it's not one barrier that you can remove one by one. And you expressed it so well, Mr. Blimpo, when you were talking about necessary but not sufficient conditions. And unless you address all the necessary conditions, more or less simultaneously, and try to move forward across all these fields, it's really difficult to get the impacts. And therefore, I think it would be a great mistake to draw the conclusion that you might be drawing from your research that electricity doesn't matter. I think the conclusion I would draw is you've got to do lots of other things as well, and that then you might find this kind of impact. Now, clearly that's really difficult because there's no checklist of what the necessary conditions are. And we come back to Kevin's points there about really trying to understand the context within which these necessary conditions are there. But it was fascinating to hear you playing back experiences that we'd found from our own research very strongly in the UK context, in the European context. It is exactly the same, that there are lots of necessary conditions in the absence of which you have this web of constraints of doing things that people regard as desirable, and you have to do them all, rather than imagining that any one of them is either going to be enough or doesn't matter, which is the difficulty.
We'll take one more question, Michael, over there, and then
Yeah, sorry, another UCL. Great comments. I just wanted to raise the question of whether actually the presentation's conflating two very different things. In terms of your very early chart about relationship between economy and energy, which was log, and that means it's completely dominated. The vast majority of countries are poor countries, which is fine when you're focusing on issues like rural electrification and primarily social-related issues of the discussion we've just had. But you also made comments about global energy and environment, and frankly, almost all those countries are very little relevance to global environment. It's dominated by countries that have at least $10,000 per capita income. completely dominates all the rest of the world. And the interesting thing is, above $10,000 per capita, all those relationships break down. So, you look at the trend of OECD countries over the last 30 years, there is no correlation between GDP and emissions. So I think you need to disentangle whether you're talking about the social development issues or the global environment issues, because the underlying statistics and trends and everything are completely different in relation to them.
Okay, I'll abuse my power and sneak in a question because you guys mostly made comments. So I have two questions. One is, have you thought about doing something similar in urban setting? Because what we found is in an urban setting where you pretty much by definition close to the grid, you also have a number of households that don't take it up, and whether there could be more of an existence of complementarity. So that might be interesting. The second question is we've asked this question for decades about, what's the proper bundling? We assume, and we have some tentative evidence that the impact of having access to some kind of all-weather road, some kind of sanitation and water, and some kind of electricity is going to be way bigger than, the whole is bigger than the sum of the part kind of thing. Has anybody ever done a good RCT on that? Because presumably it would be possible to do that. And if not, is this something that is in the works?
We've done a good RCT on urban electrification or on? On both. Okay. On the bundling and on the wow, thank you. A lot of great comments, and thank you to Musa. Those were very, very thoughtful comments. Let me just take a couple minutes to respond. I agree that there are a lot of factors that are important to policymaking. For instance, I've seen how politically powerful rural electrification is. It's something you see on the billboards. The Kenyan government in the recent elections was advertising how many households they connected. So I agree that there are a lot of other factors. And I think it's an important point on complementarities. Musa raised it, and several of the commenters. Although I'm not saying we should never do electrification. I think there are questions about prioritization and sequencing. And so one data point that I would raise is we've looked across various countries that have embarked on rural electrification projects. And not to suggest that the U.S. did it correctly, but just as a data point, the U.S. GDP per capita in the 1930s when we embarked on the Rural Electrification Act was 10 times what the GDP per capita is in Kenya. So I just want to suggest that it might be too early, that clearly there are a lot of things that rural households need, and it might be too early to be focusing on electricity. I suspect that the focus on electricity is because it's really easy to report data. It's just binary outcome. There are 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity. It's much harder to characterize the state of their healthcare system, the state of their education. It's just kind of a focus on what we can measure. Also, another important data point that the online questioner raised, the question about whether 18 months is enough. And I think that's a very valid question. We're now back in the field doing another 3-year follow-up. And so I'll be very curious to see those results. I haven't yet. Although I would point out that there are other interventions people have measured where 18 months and $1,000 per household investment, you see results. So the economist's dream intervention is to compare spending $1,000 on a household to bring them electricity to spending $1,000 just like cash, give the household $1,000 cash. There's an NGO that has been working in Western Kenya in this similar region to where we're working that does exactly that. And they find consumption impacts. They find impacts on the housing that people are living on assets. They find impacts of giving people $1,000 cash compared to ours. So I think, and after 18 months, I think that's an important data point. Yeah, there's a lot of other great comments. And can I take a couple more minutes? Yeah, okay. So I also think this is one study I have been quite assertive about drawing conclusions from it, but I think we need more studies. for instance, one thing that doesn't happen in Western Kenya is irrigation. And so people aren't using the electricity for pumping. And so you might expect to find different results where people are using water, using electricity for pumping. Another result that we are finding, although it's not in one of our top 8 outcomes, is if you look separately at employment by gender, we are finding an increase in employment for females. And we're finding that primarily amongst the households that were giving a low subsidy. So not the households where we paid 100% of the cost, but the households that were given a low subsidy. And keep in mind that with those low subsidy households, they had to put money in. And so they're essentially identifying as wealthier within the subset of households that we're looking at. And amongst those wealthier households, we see an impact on female, both employment in the labor force, but also we suspect self-employment. And so, they might be starting hair salons or starting cell phone charging. So I think it's an important consideration, but to me it also emphasizes that there could be this nonlinear relationship between income level and outcomes, that you need some kind of baseline level of income to take advantage of the electricity. I guess just one final thought on kind of conflating total energy consumption in the world and rural electrification. I guess I would just submit that I'm not the only one who's doing that conflation, and that there is a lot of discussion when we talk about energy in the developing world. Very quickly the discussion turns to rural electrification. But just to emphasize your point, to put a finer point on it, I've done a calculation where if you take all 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity, you assume that there's, say, 5 people per household, and you let the households use 50 kilowatt hours per month. That's 10 times what we found they're using. Still, that is only as much electricity as the state of Georgia uses. So it's just not, it's just not a drop in the bucket. Where the real growth is, I suspect, or, by deduction, it must be non-rural electrification. It must be the urban consumers who are buying their first refrigerators, the industrial use, the 20-story high-rises in Lagos, the air-conditioned shopping malls in the center cities. So, yeah, I agree with that completely, that there's the conflation between kind of rural electrification and thinking about broader issues around energy in the developing world.